this audience and for what James is, I guess, conveying, this word greeting here means to rejoice or to be glad. Now you think about, I know we're only in verse 1, but you think about what James has said. He's identified himself as a slave, which is a term that his audience is really familiar with. He's writing to people who are scattered out of their homeland. You know, they have lost track of family lineage, tribal lineage, all that stuff. And he's writing to them, telling them, hey, be encouraged or be glad, rejoice. And he's gonna go through some things, as you see here in the other 4 chapters, as we begin to study all of this. And some things that there's not really a whole lot of rejoicing. There's not a whole lot of, man, that's awesome, I'm going to be glad because I'm going to suffer. You know, it's that kind of thing but James is telling them, listen, greetings, rejoice, be glad. And as we pick up next week, we'll look and we'll see he continues that whole concept or that whole line of thought, because he begins verse 2 by saying, count it all joy or consider it all joy. And so, you know, he begins to, I guess, kind of set them up. And, you know, they don't really have a lot to be encouraged about or a lot to be excited about. But you can already tell that there's something within James. There's something that's happening in James' life, which is why I know that he's a believer, because he wouldn't have this hope, he wouldn't have this excitement to write to people and call himself a bond slave or a servant. He wouldn't do all those things if he didn't have a personal relationship with Christ as his Lord and Savior. And I know it's not here, but I just wanted to give you a little bit more background on James. And so I'm going to flip the page so I'll make sure I get all this right. But I was reading through some history books, and I'm not a big history person, but every now and then you come across things that, you know, you feel like they're essential for you to kind of understand, all right, here's a better picture of who this person was or how this person conducted themselves. And you know James, you know, he's the half-brother of Judas. We talked about how he's a leader in the church. You know, he's kind of an important guy. He's identified himself as a bond slave. But how did that play out in his life? And I think you can look at that and you can see how it played out in his life when you look at the end of his life. You know, James, like a lot of the other believers and a lot of the disciples that you look at, they were martyred. And it wasn't just a thing where, like, you know, they did something wrong and, you know, whatever. But it's always, I don't know, it's always interesting to me to see that. And so what I really want you to do is just kind of listen. I know it's going to be a lot to read, but just hang with me and listen to this. What's going on is the Pharisees came up to James, and they were looking for James to help them put down what they considered to be false teachings about Jesus Christ. Ultimately, what they were doing was asking James to deny that Christ was the Son of God. For him to, because they knew James was a leader, they wanted to get James up in front of the people, and you'll hear that in just a second. They wanted to get him up in front of the people and him to tell the congregation or all the people in the church, hey, listen, Jesus wasn't really who he said he was, because that would make the Pharisees look better and not be painted in such a bad light. And they were trying to, you know, I guess, kill out all of Christianity and put an end to it. But James really didn't kind of go along with that plan. It says, therefore, they came therefore in body to James, and they said, we entreat you, restrain the people, for they are gone astray in their opinions about Jesus, as if he were the Christ. So you see the problem. And he says, we entreat you to persuade all who come here for the day of Passover concerning Jesus. For we all listen to your persuasion, since we, as well as all the people, bear your testimony that you are just, and you show partiality to none. So James had a reputation as being an honest guy. And so they say, do you therefore persuade the people not to entertain erroneous opinions concerning Jesus, for all the people, and we also listen to your persuasion. Take your stand then upon the summit of the temple, that from that elevated spot you may be clearly seen, and your words may be plainly audible to all the people. For in order to attend the Passover, all the tribes have gathered together, and some of the Gentiles also. And to the scribes and Pharisees' dismay, James boldly testified that Christ himself sits in heaven at the right hand of the great power, and shall come on the clouds of heaven. It says, then the scribes and the Pharisees said to themselves, we have not done well in producing this testimony to Jesus, but let us go up and throw him down, that they may be afraid and not believe in him. And so, according to the scribes and the Pharisees, they threw down James, and they began to stone him, for he was not killed by the fall. But he turned and he kneeled down, and he said, I pray to you, Lord God, our Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And while they were thus stoning him to death, one of the priests, to whom testimony is borne by Jeremiah the prophet, began to cry aloud, saying, cease, what do you do? And the just man is praying for us. But one among them, who was one of the fullers, took the staff which he was accustomed to wring out the garments he dyed, and he hurled it at the head of the just man, and so he suffered martyrdom. And they buried him on the spot, and then they erected a pillar in his honor and in memory of him. So what you see is, you've got this guy who said he's already sold out to Christ. I mean, he writes a book that's included in our Bible that was inspired by the Holy Spirit. And even to the point of death, he never denies that Jesus was the Christ, that Jesus was the Son of God. And so it's so interesting to see the drastic change in his life. I mean, and it's hard for me to tell you in words or to paint a picture of that, but that's exactly what we should have in our life. I mean, here's James, who lived with Jesus, saw him, listened to him, saw him do things, but didn't believe in him just like the rest of his family, and then moved from that point to this point where he's willing to give up his life because he knows that Jesus is the Son of God. He's not going to deny that fact. You know, no matter what happens, even at the point of death, even knowing that when he got up there, they're going to put him to death because he knows he's not going to compromise and say what they want him to say. He knows he's going to testify, I know that Jesus is the Son of God. You know, that's the same faith that I want to have in my life, and you know, I want to be able to identify myself as a bondservant of God and of Jesus Christ. But at times, you know, that's a struggle, and I know that's probably the same in your life. And as we look through this book, and as we study it, and as you guys read, preparing for Sunday school, and you think about this passage, and hopefully you'll think about this story as well, you know, think about how that applies to your life. You know, could the same thing be said of you? You know, could you identify, or would someone else identify you and say, oh yeah, I know that person. I've seen them. I've seen how they live their life. I know that they're a slave to God. I know that they live for God and no one else. Or would it be different? You know, it's easy to say like what we wish we are in our lives, or what we hope people see us as. But it's a whole nother thing when you get somebody else to look at you who's watched you and seen everything you do, you know, on a daily basis, or is around you a lot of the time, and they really know your character and they really know who you are. You know, when they begin to examine you and point out things that, hey, listen, that doesn't line up with what you tell me you believe, you know, we often get on the defensive, and we shouldn't have to. You know, it should be a thing where we are able to be identified as, hey, he or she is a bondservant. They're a slave to Christ. You know, so think about that, and as you begin to get ready, I guess for Sunday school on Sunday morning, you know, think about some of the things that we talked about. You know, how would you explain this whole, I guess, slave ship, or the difference in the terms for slave here, and why James chose to use, or why God used him to write doulos instead of the other word for a slave, you know, someone who was bought or not born into it. You know, how would you explain to someone, I choose to be a slave to God. I was born to be a slave because of my second birth. You know, how would you explain all those things? And so those are the type of things like I'd like for you to think through and kind of prepare you, I guess, for Sunday school and Sunday morning, and just for you guys to get together and talk as a group and as a class. Do you have any questions? Anything at all? I know we only covered one verse, so it's not like we really covered a whole lot of material. And sometimes, like, I'll just tell you, sometimes we're going to cover one verse, sometimes we're going to cover, 4 or 5. I don't really plan to do much more than that, because I want us to just take it slowly. And there's some interesting things, like when you go on down to verses 12 down through 18, like there's a whole lot in there about sin and temptation and where it comes from and how people deal with it, and how to identify it and not, try to pass the blame on somebody else, and really own up to it yourself.
Josh,
yes.
You said in John 7, I just think it's interesting, you pointed out that James didn't believe at first, and then from that point to 10 or 15 years later, he's saying he's a bondservant. And just a note, some of you guys may be in that same boat of a scoffer, I don't know. I just think of Chad Muller. Some of y'all know Chad. It was neat. 2 years ago, that young man would have said, I don't believe in Jesus Christ in this way, and he would have told you. And to see this young man, those of you that know him, God has just transformed his life because he encountered the gospel. Christ changed him. And some of y'all may be in that boat where you're still in that scoffing. Man, I mean, he can change you, and it's true. I just thought it was interesting.